Okay, so this is my favorite theory that we're going over tonight. It's existential theory. Um, it's often seen as fairly negative, and that's because the early philosophers uh, that developed this theory early on were sometimes a little negative about things. But the whole concept of nihilism or nothingness and things like that. But as time went on, uh, existential theory really changed and became what I think is a much more positive theory. I did include the definition of existentialism from the ACA Encyclopedia of Counseling in there. So make sure you read that. It gives a nice overview of existentialism. Um, if anybody ever says, I don't know what I'm talking about, I'd be like, what are you talking about? I wrote the definition. So let's see what else. So a lot of times people do confuse existential philosophy with existential psychology. And in your notes, you're going to see a list of both existential philosophers and uh, key psychologists in the existential movement. And the only reason I put the philosophers in there is you should be able to recognize the names. They're not going to be on a test or anything like that. The only thing you need to focus on are the psychologists. Um, so I think that the so let's just kind of look at the word existential comes from the Latin word existare, meaning to exist, to stand out, or my favorite thing, to emerge, because I think we're all emerging. Now, personally, this is my personal uh, belief that I like the word emerge. Uh, so a lot of counselors think that people grow and become, and they say, well, I'm no longer the person I used to be, which may be true. But my philosophy is a little different. I believe that we're all born as the individuals we are supposed to be. It's just that through interactions with other human beings and environments that uh, impose negative experiences on us, we begin to change and we move away from who we're truly supposed to be. And by the time we're young adults, we may be far away from the people that we were meant to be. And so the way I see the word emerge is kind of a process of self-discovery, figuring out, well, what is our meaning, our purpose? Who was I truly meant to be before I picked up all this negative baggage and had all these negative experiences in my life, and they reshaped who I am. And so I believe counseling is really helping the individuals, to become aware of who they genuinely are and to let go of all of the negative baggage and unfinished business that they picked up along the way. And, so emerging is really a letting go of everything I'm really not. So that's what I think self-discovery really is. Uh, so some of the philosophers, Soren Kierkegaard, Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche, Jean-Paul Sartre. Sometimes I say Sartre, sometimes I say Sartre, it depends. Uh, and Sartre, is really a transitionary philosopher, and then we get into much more positive philosophy, like Martin Buber, Paul Tillich, um, and we'll talk a little bit about them as well. But we move from kind of I'm alone in this universe, in this life, and having some existential angst about that. I'm truly alone, to relationship, I, thou experiences. Who would I be without others in my life? The experience of others. And so that aspect, which I believe is key to therapy, um, really changes over time in existential philosophy. Psychologists, and we're going to talk a little bit about each one of these. We got Viktor Frankl, we got Rollo May, we have Irvin Yalom. I do have a link to an interview with Rollo May um, in the content on D2L. Hopefully the link will work for you. If not, you can probably look it up. So let's talk about and remember, all of these theorists for psychology came much later than the philosophers. So this goes back much further in history, but we're going to start around the early 1900s. So let's start with Viktor Frankl. Once again, born in Vienna, became a medical doctor in 1930. And then we don't see much in his history until like 1946, but then he becomes a PhD in 1949, also from Vienna. So the reason for that time lapse is from 1942 to 45, he was a Jewish prisoner of war in multiple Nazi concentration camps. He was in Auschwitz and Dachau during World War II. Most of his family was killed as a result of the German occupation, the Nazi occupation in World War II. So when we think about Viktor Frankl, the whole time between 1942 and 45, even though he was experiencing the horrors of concentration camps, he was basically thinking about existential philosophy and how he might, use that to help others. And so he was writing this entire book in his mind during the time he was in a concentration camp. And he believes that this gave his life meaning. And that's what helped him to survive. And then 1 year after World War II in 1946, that's when he published the book, Man's Search for Meaning. Of course, back then he just used the word man because we hadn't hit, the equal rights movement or feminism or anything else. But, I would say, it really means humans search for meaning. His theory, well, the first half of the book was about what it was like for him being in a concentration camp. And the second half of the book was about his existential theory called logotherapy, logo meaning word or healing through reason. So, yeah, I think it's a pretty interesting book. It's a little paperback. It doesn't take long to read. You could probably read it in a couple days. Rollo May. Um, Rollo May's an interesting fellow. Uh, I'll just leave it at that. He lived in Ohio and Michigan as a child. Um, it's been a lot of mixed reports about his family life. I think, depended on what mood he was in when he was asked the question about his history. You might say he had a really caring family. Some might say it was an unhappy home life. So kind of mixed history on that. Um, he experienced two failed marriages himself. Uh, he went through a really winding journey of finding existentialism. So he studied Greek civilization when he was really young. Um, Later, he studied at Union Theological Seminary. Now, Union Theological Seminary is affiliated with Columbia Teaching University, um, and it's in New York City. Um, I don't think his time at Union lined up with Tillich's time when Tillich was teaching at Union. But I know that existentialism was part of the philosophy being discussed during his time there. So, Union Theological Seminary, that's a very liberal seminary that teaches religion. But later, he studied with Adler in Vienna. So once he really got into psychology, Adler was still around and he went to Vienna to study with Adler. And I guess if he had to choose anybody to study with at that point, I would have probably chosen Adler too. So good choice. Um, so here's another interesting theme or thread, you might say. So while he was working on his doctorate, he suffered from tuberculosis. And at that time, you know, uh, you might not survive. And so he suffered from that for 2 years. And while he was, bedridden for much of the time, he read Freud and Kierkegaard and Tillich and really familiarized himself with both existential philosophy and psychology. I guess a couple of his most famous books are The Meaning of Anxiety and Love and Will, 1950, 1969. Um, I think one of the most current individuals who's still writing books and doing therapy is Irvin Yalom, and now his son is following in his footsteps. But a lot of students like reading his books. He wrote a great book on existential group therapy. It's like a brick. It's like 3 inches thick. Um, and but he also wrote a lot of books that are um, they're not novels. They're like, nonfiction. He writes about experiences with his clients and in therapy. So one would be The Gift of Therapy. And these are enjoyable reading as well. One Staring at the Sun, The Gift of Therapy, a few others. They're good reads. You'd enjoy them. I always like reading about what other psychologists and therapists do with their clients and what their experiences are. And, helps me with my clients. So let's talk a little bit about existential theory. And this is probably one of the theories where I share some of my own life experiences. Um, so my viewpoint on existential theory is really follows Viktor Frankl's, what is our human meaning? And, I think that therapy is really about our search for meaning, about, first of all, our self-awareness, who am I? And then what is my meaning in life? If we find our meaning, we find our purpose. But nobody else can give us meaning. We must discover that on our own. So it's not something that other people can provide for us. So we begin to understand our own human experience and human experience in general. And one of the things that the earlier philosophers talk a lot about is death. And, I think there's a couple classes that are not required. We do teach them anyway. But the first one is grief and loss. I think every human being experiences grief and loss. And so every other year we teach the grief and loss class. So it's a 2-year degree, so everybody has the opportunity to take it. So if you're with a client long enough, you're going to experience, grief and loss in therapy. The second one is human sexuality. And even though that's not an existential topic, I think it's a topic that everybody encounters in therapy. Both death and sexuality are innate aspects of our human existence, and two things nobody ever talks about. So it's also two things that always come up in therapy. I think it's two subjects that many people are uncomfortable with. So Dr. Gruber teaches counseling and human sexuality once every 2 years as well. I had these classes when I was a master's student. Some degrees still think they're so important that they include them in the curriculum. Some states do require the human sexuality and counseling class. So depending on, do you think you're going to move to another state after you graduate, you might want to look up and see what courses that state's licensure board requires. Because if you do move to another state and they require that class, you can take it now as an elective. So, you won't just say, oh, I moved to the state, I can't get my license. I got to wait a whole semester and take one class, but, we offer them both. So, if you want to move, check out what that state requires. Amazingly, it's not a K-CREP requirement. Okay, so when we think about death and existentialism, eventually each of us realizes that not only everybody we know is going to die, everybody we love is going to die, but we are going to die. And that changes our perspective of existence because there is an impermanence to our physical selves and others. And so it adds a poignancy to our own existence. If we lived forever, there would be little motivation to do something soon. We'd have forever to do it. What's our motivation? And so It does, the concept of our own mortality promotes our own concept of growth and provides some sort of intrinsic motivation that we don't have forever to do what we want to do or to be who we want to be. So at first, death is a negative thing to us. But now I don't really see it as a positive or a negative. I think it's something that it adds value to each and every day. It gives, you know, if we truly lived in the present and we know that, you know, we may not live forever, we might live as if each day were our last. And wouldn't that change what we did that day? So there's a story about a monk who imagined every day, a Buddhist monk, every day, a little bird would land on his shoulder and whisper into his ear, "This is your last day." And he would imagine that, and he would live that day as if it was his last day. So, as I've contemplated this in my own life, I used to think that, wow, if I were to live this as my last day, I'd want to do spectacular things. But as I've grown older, my goal is to live a day like I live every day, whatever I'm doing, because I want to really get to the point in life where what I do each day is what I love. And so that would have meaning. May not be something that would make me famous or get on the news, but simply spending time with a child or a student or talking about something I find meaningful. That's how I'd want to spend every day. So these things take a lot of thought sometimes to arrive at these conclusions. Sometimes these things are like a koan or a riddle. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie The Last Samurai, but when the samurai in the movie dies, um, there was a breeze and all of these cherry blossoms came drifting down and fell on him. And he said he spent his whole life seeking the perfect cherry blossom. But it was only at that point when he was dying that he realized every cherry blossom was perfect. And so are we. So even though every human is imperfect, that's perfectly acceptable. Imperfection is part of our growth, our personal understanding, our learning process. Mistakes are meant to be learned from. So ultimately, we're each alone, and this results in what we call the existential vacuum, realizing that we're alone, even if we're in a crowd, and maybe you felt this way at some point. Even if you're in a crowd or a party or whatever, maybe you felt ultimately alone. And that seems like a negative, but that's really what one of the focuses of early philosophy was on. And then Martin Buber came along and he wrote the book called I and Thou, and it simply means me and you. And he says, there is no me without a you. Who would I be without you? I'd be nothing really without any interaction with other. And so it kind of changed that perspective that yes, we are truly alone, and yet we can't develop fully as a human being without interaction with others. And so, who I am depends on my interaction with others. And then in the beginning of the philosophy, some people thought, oh, life is really meaningless. Well, that's kind of negative as well. Why bother? But it's kind of a paradox because we find our own meaning, we create our own meaning. And so we are a participant in meaning making in our lives. I've seen so many clients that were extremely successful in life, successful by society standards, which means they had a great job, they got promoted, or they owned their own business, they had a mansion, 3 or 4, sports cars, um, you know, the whole deal. And yet they were like really depressed. And that's because everything that they were taught to place meaning in was actually a ruse. So, we're taught to be financially successful, to have a great house, to have a car, whatever it might be. The most peace I've ever found is when I was living in India with nothing, basically. Um, so it's interesting that they found that they were sold this bill of goods and they've worked half their life to succeed, but that success really didn't give them meaning. And so their question in counseling is, what will? And so we start over again. So in Martin Buber's book, I and Thou, he talks about 3 different relationships. So, I think that we can talk a little bit about these 3. I think these 3 relationships with other become our experience of being. And, so the first one is that we experience other in nature, which is all around us. And I think a lot of times we're isolated from nature. We're in human created dwellings, and people rarely leave this campus. 20 years ago, students were outside all day long, throwing frisbees, playing guitar. They didn't want to go into their dorms. Now it's kind of like everybody's inside. Um, you know, there's all the Gen X memes like, yeah, parents kicked us out in the morning and we came back when the street lights came on. In fact, sometimes they had to remind our parents on the news, it's 10 o'clock. Do you know where your child is? So nature. And one thing I want to share is kind of we'll talk about existential experiences and we'll see if you have any. Most people do. So it's not just an experience of nature, but it's like, if we go for a walk in the park, oh, this is nice. That's pretty. Great flower. Do we really feel one with nature? Do we feel like we are a part of nature? Because that disconnect creates most of the problems with nature. We don't treat nature with reverence. We don't revere nature. So feeling at one with nature, a part of nature, and then interacting with nature as part of nature. That's the first I thou experience. The second one, which I think is really important for us as counselors, is an experience of other human beings. And there's all types of relationships that we encounter, families of origin and our own families, uh, friendships, social and other, acquaintances. People are here, we meet them for an hour, but they change our lives, never see them again. Um, Clients and therapists, colleagues at work. So think about all of the different types of relationships that we have and the amounts of time that we have those relationships for, all different amounts of time. So, yeah. So when we enter into a relationship, it could be for an hour, it could be for our entire lives. But both individuals are changed as a result of that interaction. And it's important to be present in that relationship for however long it is, to experience other and to grow and change or discover. It's a part of that relationship. The last one, it's up to you what you believe. If you're an atheist, you don't believe in nothing. Well, actually, you do, but it is a belief system so that nothingness after we die is a belief system. It's not non-belief. That's what atheists believe. So you still have a belief system. But if you may believe in some higher power, that would be Buber's third experience of other, some divine entity larger than ourselves. Like I said, you don't have to believe that. That's just Martin Buber. He was Jewish. So let's talk kind of about existential experiences. So existential experiences are really when we experience other on some intimate level where we feel as though we are at one with or changed in some positive way, or we gain insight or meaning as a result of that experience. It's where we are fully present in that experience. So I'm just going to give you my personal examples. These experiences certainly aren't limited to the ones I share. So let me give you an example of nature. So when I was growing up, like 12, 13, my parents didn't think I could get in any trouble if I was out camping or hiking. So I would leave for weeks at a time and hike the Appalachian Trail, which ran through our small town. And so one time I was out and I just put up a tent and it had rained. And um, so a mist came in when the rain stopped. I was just sitting there, kind of like enjoying the fog. I didn't see that too much. And then I heard these footsteps and I was a little tense. Like, is somebody coming? Is it another hiker? You know, is it safe? And and a large buck deer emerged from this mist. And I think I startled it as much as it startled me. And so we stood there and stared at each other. And as soon as we realized we weren't a threat to each other, we kind of relaxed. And as we looked at each other, I felt connected to that creature. Like, wow, yeah, I'm part of all this. I'm not separate from all of this. And after a while, like, okay, I'm safe and this guy's just hanging out. I'll move on. And so it slowly walked away. Um, let's see, an experience of death. Uh, so let's see. I was young. I was like 18 or 19 in my senior year of college. And I had just gotten this 1966 Volkswagen convertible and fixed it up. And it was a spring day, and I was driving too fast on the country roads, and I didn't realize that they had just repaved them. Now, repaving in Chambersburg meant throw some tar and stones down, and you're good to go. They didn't actually change the road. Uh, so my car started sliding and it went up a bank and started rolling. And the next thing I know, I found myself outside of the car in the middle of this farmer's field. And I looked over at the car, and there was just a crumpled mess. There wasn't anything left of it. And it was like a bad movie. The AM radio was still playing. I wish I could remember the song it was playing. Um, the wheel was slowly turning, and the rest, there was nothing left of it. And I'm like, wow, how could anybody survive that? And I was somewhat in shock and all bloody, and my shoe didn't have my shoes on anymore. And I thought, wow, what if I'm dead? And then I felt all of this anxiety and like, wow, I'm not supposed to die yet. Got a lot to do. Those finals coming up. And and as I looked out over the field, I just saw all of these beautiful yellow flowers. And as my eyes began to focus, I realized that it was all of my notes for an entire year on yellow legal paper blowing away. And I just had to let them go. They really didn't mean anything. And then I'm like, okay, well, if I am dead, this is a pretty nice day. And, I can let go of all that. And I'm just going to see what happens next. So then I kind of accepted the possibility of death. And then I wondered, well, how am I going to know whether I'm dead or alive? And I said, well, if somebody stops and just ignores me, I'm probably dead. And then I'm just going to go and see what happens next. But if, they pick me up and take me to the hospital, I'll probably be alive, you know. And so one of the neighbors was riding by, they stopped, took me to the hospital. And unless that was a cruel divine joke, and this is all afterlife, which I'm enjoying, I guess I'm alive. But it took away a lot of the death anxiety that I had experienced as a younger person. Um, let's see. Uh, so here's a pretty common one. Um, when I had my first child, and every child after that, the first time I held that new baby, and they'd wrap their little hand around my finger, I experienced, unconditional love. Uh, and what I thought was unconditional love up to that point really wasn't. Um, all right, I'll give you one more. Uh, the so every now and then I'll be in a bar with my friends and I'll go to the restroom and I'll wash my hands and I'll look in the mirror, and it's if my entire life and time collapse when I'm looking at myself in that mirror. And it's like I'm supposed to do a little check-in, like, hey, okay, I'm here. What's going on in my life? Am I where I should be? Am I happy with my life? Am I not living my life the way I should? Do I need to make some changes? And it's as if time stands still. And I kind of do this mental check-in. I'm not trying to do this, it just happens. And it's a little sobering. So, when I'm done checking in, put some water on my face and go back and have another drink. But, it is a good check-in on where I'm at in my life. Um, I've made some realizations and some changes. All right, so that is 3 or 4 examples of existential experiences. But, yours don't have to be the same. They could be anything. But it's where you feel totally connected, totally present, have some meaning realization, some meaningful encounter or thought. And you remember it, you know. Uh, Other times were like when I was with people who were dying. That was another time, or many times. So, um, I think that, yeah, I think that's going to be probably your discussion post for this week. Get to write if you had any existential experiences. All right, let's talk a little more about this theory. Corey outlined some basic dimensions of the human condition. I think these are pretty valid. The capacity for self-awareness. I don't believe humans are the only ones with the capacity for self-awareness. I think animals have that capacity. I think scientists used to be a little too egotistical. So, kind of like I think, therefore I am. Humans possess freedom and responsibility, even if you're in a concentration camp. So here's the thing about freedom and responsibility. We may be in prison, but we have the freedom to react to any situation, however we choose, emotionally and thoughtfully. We might not be able to escape a cell or a concentration camp, but I can choose how I'm going to react emotionally and cognitively to that situation. So once we realize we have that personal freedom, some might think, well, I can do whatever I want. But the result of freedom is that we can't blame anybody else. We have to take responsibility for our own emotions, our thoughts, our reactions. Nobody else is to blame. I can't give somebody else blame when it's really my own responsibility. So with freedom comes great responsibility. They always come together. Sartre would say, we are our choices. So humans strive to create our own identity and establish meaningful relationships with others. This moves us towards personal meaning as well. It takes a personal courage to be, which is one of Paul Tillich's books. And the phrase courage to be really means it takes courage to be ourselves, to not be fake or to not change ourselves so that we could be accepted by others. It takes courage to be our authentic selves because we might be rejected by others, and that's okay. Courage doesn't mean we don't have fear. Courage simply means that even when we are afraid, we move forward. Humans search for meaning, purpose, values, goals. Anxiety is a condition of life. Nobody likes anxiety, but I've never grown when I was totally happy. I just basked in that happiness. I've only grown when, you know, I experienced change. So even good change brings about anxiety, weddings, promotions, anything, any change brings about some form of anxiety. Humans are aware of our own eventual death and mortality. Awareness of death can add significance to life. If we think about a cicada's lifespan, or, you know, um, Robert Frost wrote a poem called The Spot. It's about, he goes to write down a poem, and as he brings his pen close to the page, he realizes that it's not a spot on his page, but a tiny little bug. And the bug recoils as he moves his pen closer. Even that tiny gnat has self-preservation, has meaning, wants to survive. I think that time doesn't really matter. So a lot of people say, oh, they died so young, or they had a good long life. Life is really not about time. Meaning is really has nothing to do with time. It's about how we spend that time. It could be long, it could be short. Meaning is not about how long we live, it's about how we live. So, you know, I really think that if we live well, there is no time. When we think about the past, you know, it may lead to depression or regrets. When we think about the future, it may lead to worry or anxiety. But if we're thinking about the past or the future, it seems like a long time, but where aren't we? We're not in the present. And when we're truly immersed in the present, whether it's with another person or doing something we love or find meaningful, you'll notice that we lose track of time, that there is no time because we're totally present. Philosophers or existential theorists might say that if we're not living an authentic life, we're really dead. We're just existing. So if you're not living authentically, if you're not genuine, if you haven't found yourself, then you're just kind of going through the movements every day. So there's not a lot of techniques. You know, Corey would say, oh, you can borrow techniques. But in reality, the best techniques are really helping a client to figure out who they truly are, which leads to finding what they think is important in life, meaning, and then what would they like to do with their time? How would they like to spend their time, which is purpose? And when we even think about that phrase, oh, how'd you spend your time? You know, I've been with hundreds of people who were dying. And, you know, they only talked about time. They never talked about money or things or possessions. The only things they talked about were time and people. So when we think about spending time, money's really an illusion. The value of money, there is no value to money in reality. It's only the value which we give it. But time is our most valuable commodity because we cannot exchange that. We can't get more of it. It's much more valuable than money. And when we say spend your time, how are you spending this most valuable commodity of life? Well, the trick is to get to a point where you are paid for your time, but it's something you would do anyway. You transcend your dichotomies. You turn work into play and meaning. But, I don't think many people would say, I'll give you an hour of my life to wash dishes for $7. You know, sometimes we have to do that to survive or to help others survive. That's a little different. That's called sacrifice. All right. Comments or questions? Hmm? Nothing? Yeah.
Accident, why is it we can have what would feel like a near-death experience, and in those moments, why so quickly after does it dissipate that we can't hold on to that feeling of like living in the moment and realizing what you went through, because it seems so evident and fresh and new right now, but as just a little bit of time goes on, it dissipates so much that it's almost like it didn't happen, and then you're right back to why are we unable to hold on to that?
So yeah, I got you. So the question is, like when I had that accident, after we have some meaningful experience and we realize, oh, this is what life's about. Why does that realization and motivation to live perhaps as we should dissipate and we go back to our normal everyday lives that we had before? That's called the Scrooge syndrome. So the Scrooge syndrome is, if you know the story of Scrooge, all he was, living a crummy life. He was selfish. He was alone. He wasn't loving others. And he was visited by all kinds of spirits, past, present, future. And he had this revelation that he shouldn't live that way anymore, that wasn't giving him meaning, the selfishness. Material gain wasn't giving him meaning. And so, he buys a, Christmas bird and gives everybody a raise and goes to their Christmas party and all of this. Well, the Scrooge syndrome is what happened to Scrooge a month or two after that. Did he go back to the way he was, or did he continue living a meaningful and loving life? Well, so the Scrooge theory would say that most people who experience some revelation and want to change their lives gradually go back to that previous baseline and, to the daily grind and to materialism and whatever it might be. And so, my personal reason for that is basically bread and circuses, or in modern times, it'd be called beer and football. So, you know, so much in society has bought in to, oh, this is great. You work all week and grind away, and then you live for the weekend, and you end up being entertained and not doing anything anyway. So, for instance, football is part of the entertainment industry. So, if we, drink beer, which is currently the opium of the people, and you watch entertainment, which might be football, have you accomplished anything, or were you just drugged and entertained for hours? So you work all week for somebody else and they gain a profit off your most valuable commodity, which is your time. And then you spend your free time subdued and entertained. Yeah. So, it's like we have to constantly remind ourselves that this meaning that we discover is not the meaning of society at large, because there are other powers at play. Yeah. What else? Yeah.
This is about us individually, Adler focused on social aspects. Is there
Well,
together?
yeah, I think they do work together. I think Adler was altruistic, you know. He believed in helping individuals who will in turn help society. All right, we'll stop recording. We are going to watch the student presentation. If you're watching just the recording asynchronously, you too, please watch the student presentation.